Hello, my name is Ximena Navarro, and today I will be presenting on the social issue of prostitution. We will be discussing throughout this presentation if prostitution should be legalized or not. It's arguments in favor, arguments against it, and at the end, I will just go over my personal opinion. But the reason I chose this topic is because I feel like prostitution is often discussed in extreme and oversimplified ways. It is frequently framed either as empowerment or as exploitation without fully considering public health, safety, human rights, and social context. This issue is especially relevant in societies where gender inequality and violence exist. For example, I grew up in Mexico. I'm a Mexican citizen, and it's something that I have seen, and it's something that concerns me because I currently live in Mexico. Um, Especially because of its relation with human trafficking, which we will be discussing in the previous slides. So I feel like this requires a very balanced and critical approach. So let's start with defining prostitution. Here we can see that prostitution is described as the practice of engaging in relatively indiscriminate sexual activity in general with someone who is not a spouse or a friend, and in exchange for immediate payment in money or other valuables. I should emphasize that prostitutes may be of any gender and of sexual orientation, but historically, most prostitutes have been women with male clients. Um, I feel like um, yes, it is true that historically, as I said, women have been more prominent in this area, but feel like nowadays we can see more transgenders in prostitution, and it is really sad because it ties to socioeconomic status and pretty much a lot of discrimination that they've been facing. But just as a comment. Um, so just to recap, prostitution is a social issue centered on whether the exchange of sexual services for money should be legal. The supporters, well, there's people who support this saying that it could reduce crime, improve public health, increase tax revenue, help people escape poverty, which, um, I mean, I don't know if you're like in touch with whatever's going on with Mexico and its celebrities, but recently this trans women called Wendy Guevara and Paula Suarez and Karina Torres, well, they've been sharing their experience as transgender women who started in the prostitution industry, and it helped them escape poverty, and now they have become literally celebrities who go on shows and have their own like direct their own shows, have their own channels, even sell some products. But I'm getting off topic. Um, and it would also allow adults to make their own choices, right, over their own bodies. But people against it say that prostitution would increase sexually transmitted diseases, uh, global human trafficking, and violent crime. I just want to kind of touch on the HIV epidemic, who back in the 70s, I believe it was the 70s, but how gay men wouldn't even people didn't even want to touch them or come close to them because they thought that like being gay was a sexual transmitted. But we also know that, as we said, prostitutes are of any gender, and they were also male prostitutes. So it really is a big issue that it pretty much harms everyone in a society, just like any type of discrimination. But again, as I mentioned, these opposing viewpoints are the foundation of debate. Now let's tackle historical and legal background. Supporters of prostitution uh, often point to the fact that prostitution remains legal in 10 countries in Nevada. They argue that this shows that prostitution can exist within regulated systems rather than it being entirely criminalized. The legal status of prostitution influences how it is treated by law enforcement and society. For supporters, legal exceptions demonstrate the potential of regulation, But for critics, these exemptions raise concerns about whether legalization truly protects vulnerable individuals. Now, using our sociological imagination, it can help us understand how prostitution affects both individuals, so the prostitutes, and a society as a whole, right? So, at an individual level, supporters argue that legalization could help people escape poverty and allow adults to make consensual choices about their bodies. But opponents argue that individuals face increased risks of disease and violence and, of course, exploitation. Now, in a bigger picture, so at a societal level, supporters believe that legalization could reduce crime and increase tax revenue, while opponents argue that it empowers criminal networks and it reinforces repression of women by men. How society responds to prostitution reflects broader values about power, gender, and protection. So now let's start discussing the arguments in favor. And for both the pros and the cons, I will be referencing the testimonies listed on the on on the reference that I have on the top of the page. I'm sorry, I just couldn't remember that word. Language barriers. But okay. So the first one, I'm referencing Amnesty International, and they believe that criminalizing sex work places sex workers at a greater risk because when work is treated as a criminal conduct, these sex workers can't really rely on police protection or any legal support for that matter. Reporting violence often means risking arrest, loss of income, or even punishment. And as a healthcare student, this is concerning because criminalization creates barriers to safety and support. So removing these criminal penalties would allow sex workers to collaborate with law enforcement, report abuse, and seek protection, which ultimately, and like at the end, it will improve health and safety outcomes. Number two, regulation and reduce black market crime. Now, Marshall Frank believes that from a law enforcement perspective, prostitution thrives in black markets created because of prohibition. When prostitution is legal, it operates underground, making regulation impossible and allowing criminal activity to flourish. Legalization would allow prostitution to be licensed, medically inspected, zoned, and taxed. And according to this argument, regulation would reduce illegal activity and allow police to focus on serious crimes rather than consensual behavior between adults, which that is the best case scenario, of course. And number three, Peter Singer argues that sex work is not inherently more dangerous to health when it occurs in legal and regulated environments. He also argues that sex work is unlikely to disappear regardless of legality. Let's add that sex workers view their work as a required skill and emotional labor, so it should be protected just like any regular job is. From an ethical standpoint now, policies should prioritize harm reduction, health, and the rights of sex workers rather than moral judgment. And as someone who values bodily autonomy and individual liberty like myself, I feel like this perspective emphasizes protecting people rather than punishing them and actually seeing them as humans. Now let's switch to the arguments against. So our first con would be exploitation and trauma. Melissa Furley argues that prostitution is a system of sexual exploitation and violence, particularly affecting marginalized women. Marginalized women as, let's see, most often we can see are women of color, women of lower socioeconomic status, queer women. And according to this view, women in prostitution face risk of rape, abuse, and long-term psychological trauma. And from a health perspective, trauma has really lasting consequences, and critics argue that legalization may normalize conditions that cause serious harm rather than eliminate them. Number two, human trafficking. Donna Galvin presents this argument, which is especially important for me because as a woman living in Mexico, sex trafficking is a real issue, And she argues that prostitution and sex trafficking operate as interconnected industries involving traffickers, organized crimes, and I feel like pimp is more like a US thing. Here I guess we would call it a different name, but we understand like what a pimp is, right? So she explains that media often glamorizes prostitutions while it hides its violence. We've all seen a lot of shows, a lot of um, movies where it kind of is glamorized and it truly hides all of the sad reality behind it that I feel like just with critical judgment we can kind of see, but me and my people, like we've seen it. It's very sad seeing women disappear in the news, or even people that you knew and then you found out they were human trafficked. And human trafficking is like a big thing, not even specifically related to prostitution, which is really sad. But another thing that is really sad is like organ trafficking, which is, of course, really I mean, this is my opinion, but my family, they are always scared when I go out because they're like, well, we don't want you to be human trafficked. And I feel like once you are human trafficked, there's like no way to survive because at least here we believe that okay, so maybe the bad guys might prostitute you first, and then once they don't want you anymore, they can get rid of you and like make a profit out of it with your organs. So it is really sad and it's really infuriating that this is happening, that this has happened and will continue to happen, and we really need some legal reinforcements here. Um, Critics argue that legalization could increase demand and make it easier for traffickers to exploit vulnerable individuals. Now, slide number 10, which would be our con number 3, which is continued abuse under legalization. So Joe Vargas argues that legalization does not eliminate abuse. Many individuals in prostitution are coerced or trafficked, and legalization may allow this exploitation to continue within regulated systems. There is always a way to cheat the system, and this is no exception. So from this perspective, legalization risks placing a legal label on harm rather than addressing the root causes of exploitation, such as poverty, coercion, and gender-based violence. And now my personal perspective on this. Um, After viewing both sides of this issue, I personally believe that prostitution should be legalized, but strongly reinforced through regulation and protection. As a healthcare student, I see legalization as the way to reduce harm by improving access to medical care, safety, and legal protection, rather than pushing people into unsafe conditions through criminalization. I feel like this especially hits me because as a queer woman and as someone who is, well, as part of the community, we all need to know some part of history, right? And just a little fun fact of like well, it's not so fun because once you know the reason, it stops being fun. So the reason why the L goes first in LGBTQ, like the acronym, is because lesbians were the only ones who helped men with the HIV epidemic because people would refuse to help them, to give them medical access just because of their orientation. And basically prostitution, it tackles everyone, and in this case it tackled, I mean, well, it's centered around gay men, right? And gay people also exist in prostitution, and they have very high demand because I mean, even though we progressed, homophobia is still a thing, the closet is still a thing, and they're gonna go and, well, people, they're gonna do what they want to do, and if we don't have the medical care and the safety, it's gonna turn badly like it did before. But again, I'm getting off track. And at the same time, as a woman living in Mexico, I've recognized that sex trafficking and gender-based violence are serious and ongoing problems. I mean, And now, I don't know if you know about the case of, I believe it was in Monterrey, but this girl who was left in the road um, at like after going to a party, but she was all by her friends. I mean, by all by herself because her friends like abandoned her. And the last picture that we have of her is like her standing in the middle of the road with a long skirt. So now I can't wear long skirts without remembering her, and it is no surprise that she was trafficked and well, sadly passed away. So it's a real problem and it affects our everyday lives. Even that just little details of wearing long skirt and associating it with that girl, it shows the depth of it. And legalization must include strict oversight, strong enforcement against traffickers and abusers, and an accessible exit programs for those who want to leave sex work. Because at the end of the day, sex work, like, it is our body. And in the best case scenario, it is us deciding that, yes, we do want to sell our body, right? But just just because we say yes, I want to, we can change our opinion. We can say, well, I don't want to do it anymore. And there should be ways to do that and not be chained to a decision. And to finalize this, as a queer woman and as a feminist, I believe that empowerment means respecting bodily autonomy while also acknowledging power imbalances. And for those reasons, legalization should prioritize public health, individual liberty, and meaningful protections against exploitation. So this will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. In reality, the topic that I wanted to address here was queerbaiting, but I couldn't find anything on Britannica, so I was like, oh, that's sad. But I feel like I still want to talk about it, so I will spend like a minute talking about queerbaiting and why it's like an important social thing to address. And I feel like if you're not within the community, you haven't really heard of this. So I think it is just like a something fun to know. So basically, queer baiting is the practice of like big corporation and medias who will bait a queer audience by telling them or like alluding that two characters in a show, in a movie, in any type of media are part of the community, or like are gay or are lesbian or queer. Um, So they will just keep feeding the delusions of the audience, saying like, "Oh yes, they're gonna eventually date at the end," but they never do. So the production, for example, the most popular production is Supernatural, the show from 2005, where they had the audience baiting. I mean, they baited the audience for like 15 years. Um, Saying like, oh yes, well these two characters are queer and they're gonna get together, and they didn't. They killed them off at the end. So they're just profiting from the audience, keeping them engaged and making revenue out of it. So I feel like this is really cool to know because it is also a social issue. Not only like we are talking about queer representation, queer identity, but also a society like capitalism and how these big corporations don't really care about the queer experience. They just want to make profit out of it. But at the same time, it has some good points. Like even by just alluding that a character may be queer, that a it's giving visibility in some way. Maybe not the type of we want, but it is starting conversation. So it's like it's a really interesting phenomenon that it's sadly still happening till this day. But yeah, it was really big on shows like Supernatural, Sherlock, what else? A bunch of Netflix shows that they canceled, and that was like those were recent, not even 2000s. But yeah, okay, that was it. Thank you very much, Dr. Cadell, for being like an amazing professor throughout the semester. I really enjoyed all of our classes, all of our assignments, and our projects were really fun, and I learned a lot, and I just had a great experience this semester. So thank you for everything, and hopefully I'll see you around. Bye bye. Thank you for all your help.